one individual hears me read this first question, they're probably going to, did I write that question in? I guess I did. No, what happened, either I left it in my briefcase the time we had the study, or I left it on my desk. Anyhow, I ran across it. And so I wanted to cover that, plus one other one I'll come to next. But this first one, going back actually a couple months ago, is an overlooked question. In Revelation chapter 7, why is the tribe of Dan missing from the 144,000? So you can turn, I won't just take my word, Dan is left out, the other tribes are there, so there's no reason to have to read it to show you that it's not there. Most of you, I think, are already aware that it's not there. And so the answer is, I don't know. You've waited all these months to hear that. Well, I think I can give you, we can look for some clues in the Bible that might help us to understand. And I'll share some of that with you here. But no, there's not a definite answer that says this is why Dan is left out. But the other tribes, of course, are not. I'm going to go back here to Judges chapter 5. Let's take a look here in the book of Judges. A couple things that may give us some clues that come down to the end time. The Israelites, of course, had come out. They're under Joshua. Well, actually, not under. He has died by the time we get here to Judges. And Deborah is a judge in the book at this period of time. And she had this to say, or recorded that she said, in Judges 5 and in verse 17, says, Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and why did Dan remain on ships? And Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by his inlets. Interesting point. Why did Dan stay in his ships? Obviously at sea, and went somewhere else. Now, some of the classical records do indicate that a significant portion of the tribe of Dan did not stay in the Middle East or in their inheritance that they had, which, by the way, was by the sea. And notice Joshua 19 tells us where they were located, what their portion was, I should say. Joshua 19. Now, they didn't all leave, but apparently a significant number did, and certainly classical sources indicate that they wound up in Ireland, where they apparently got control over whoever was there before them, and continued in the Emerald Isle, and descendants of Dan are there to this day. But others stayed behind, and did, we'll see in a moment, Joshua 19, I said, verses 40 through 46. Now the seventh lot came out of the tribe of the children of Dan, according to their families, and their territory of their inheritance was Zorah, Eshtaol, Shemesh, all these names, which probably won't mean a lot to you. But verse 46, Jarkon, these are locations, and finally notice the last one, Joppa. Now that does mean, and does show us a little something of where their inheritance was originally to be. It was along the south central coastal plain. And Joppa, of course, you read of Joppa, of course, Tel Aviv is just down the road from the ruins of Joppa today. And you read about what is it, Acts chapter 10, about, Dorcas was there, of course, Cornelius, that's where Peter had gone, and he was up to pray, fell in a trance. There was a purpose to go down, follow. The servants are coming to the door. They want to take you down to where they wanted, to Joppa, I guess it was, and to a centurion named Cornelius, and of course he would be baptized. and all of that. Well, I don't get too far ahead. But the point here is, in the next book, which is Judges 5:7, Deborah, who is now the judge, and Barak is the general or military leader under her. And she wants to know, why did Dan remain in his ships? He's sailing. A significant number of Dan did. Now, not all of them, I said. Look at Judges chapter 1 and verse 34. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley along the coastal plains. So they were forced out of their inherited area, and they migrated to that is, those who stayed behind. They migrated to the north. Now, let's go to Judges 18. Why am I taking you all around? Because there's something here in Judges 18 about the tribe of Dan that might have something to say about the time of the end. In Judges 18, verse 1 and 2, in those days there was no king in Israel. And in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in, for until that day their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. It was given, but it had not become theirs, and they actually had been moved on, and they were to the north. So the children of Dan, verse 2, sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to search it. And they said to them, go search the land. So they went to the mountains of Ephraim and to the house of Micah and lodged there. Now, who's this Micah? Well, this is where Dan gets way off on a lot of things. Let's go down to verse 27. I'll skip a lot of it. Micah is a false prophet and sets up idol worship, and the tribe of Dan buys into it. In verse 27, so they took the things Micah had made, the priest who had belonged to him, and went to Laish, to a people quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. So Dan certainly got into some warrior fights. There was no deliverer because it was far from Zidon, and Zidon by the sea of Lebanon, and they had no ties with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Bet Rehob. So they rebuilt the city, they dwelt there, they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. That's where you get the expression from Dan to Beersheba, north to south. And the very northern border it became, that what was left of the tribe of Dan came up, and they fought their way into claiming this area for themselves. The children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershon, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. That tabernacle, that is, was in Shiloh, but they were worshiping some strange gods. Now, I mentioned all of that for a couple reasons. A significant number of the tribe of Dan had already left by sea and were in their ships. Dan, when you read about him, leaves his mark everywhere, his name, named everything, named the city here, Laish, after they took it after his father, Dan. You find that Dan, when he was in the areas of Eastern Europe, where do you think the name Danube came from? Or Dnieper, with the vowel left out of the DN, Dnieper. And Denmark, Dan's mark, wherever they went anciently. But certainly a significant number of them went to Ireland. Another thing about, you find in the tribe of Dan, they seem to really buy into idolatry maybe more intently and earlier even than the rest of the tribes, and they remained that way. Many of the things that you even see of the Irish and the leprechauns and everything, of their traditions and all of that, going back to a different kind of religion. Now, I say all of that, those things may have something to do with it. Now, there is a third thing. I mentioned here the fact that they separated early on from the main tribe of Dan, and the main tribe of Dan was moved when they migrated to the north and fought and found their own territory. They just immediately accepted a different god of worship of this guy named Micah, rather than worshiping God, and whose tabernacle was at Shiloh at that time. That's where the feast was kept too. Another thing to consider in the time of the end is Ireland and Denmark are part of the 10 nations that will be a part with the beast power. Look over here in Revelation chapter 18. Now, obviously, this is all just looking, and it's speculative because there isn't a definite answer, but we look for some clues to see if we might have some idea why they are not there. Revelation 18:4, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and lest you receive of her plagues. Does Dan remain a part of that 10-nation thing, European combine? They're a part of the European Union right now, that is, Ireland is. I think Denmark is. Are they? I believe they are. So those are some things to consider as possibilities as we get closer to the time of the end, closer to the subject I want to speak about here today, and I will in a little bit, the day of the Lord, and that period of time that's coming. So that might give some clues. There obviously is something that separates them from the other 12 tribes. Yet, in some ways, they are going to be brought back because the 12 apostles, what is it, Luke 19? You will be over the 12 tribes of Israel. So when they are resurrected, when Christ returns, one of those 12 apostles will be over the tribe of Dan, from what Jesus tells us. One thing that, we'll just have to see whether how things play out here, but in some ways, some of Dan's idolatry seems to have never changed from the time of the judges, and that might have something to do with it. Here is a pre-Passover question that didn't get answered. A number of churches and ministers speak about Christ's victory on Calvary. Churches use the name Calvary in their church names, such as Calvary Methodist Church or Calvary Baptist Church. What is Calvary, and what does it mean? Well, you all know what it means. You got it down pat. You've seen it. You've probably seen it on church, the names on church, Calvary in church names and so on. There's only one scripture in the New Testament where that word is found. Now that might, right by itself, begin to send a little flag up when it's only one scripture, and that scripture is Luke 23, and it's verse 33. Luke 23, verse 33. Luke 23, 33. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. So it's a location, but here in Luke's account, it's called Calvary. Now, is that really a correct translation? Is that really telling you exactly where it is? If you should go to Jerusalem and step outside the walls of the old city, oh, over here, the district or the whatever of Calvary. There is none. Calvary is an English word, which in the English language by itself means absolutely nothing. And So where did the word come from? You will only find it in the King James and New King James Bible. If you have an NIV, if you have any other American Standard, Revised Standard, whatever, you will not find in this verse or anywhere else the word Calvary. Well, Calvary comes from the Latin word Calvaria, 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 and it's taken from the Latin Vulgate Bible, which was translated by Jerome, 300 something AD, I believe it is, or 400, and it meant the skull, the skull. Now, if you have any other translation in front of you besides the King James, New King James, it will say here in this verse we just read, the skull, the place of the skull. Okay? So how did Calvary become the calling? When I grew up, you know what the Calvary meant to me? I was in the 50s watching movies and everything, and the Calvary, they came to fight off the Indians who were shooting arrows at the wagon train, or they'd come after the bad guys who had just stole some gold from the stagecoach or whatever. That's what the Calvary was, mounted men on horses. And of course, it's still used in that sense today but here it's a specific location where Christ was crucified. Now, the New Testament, of course, is written in the Greek language, not in the Latin language. Jerome translated from the Greek into the Latin. That's how you get the word Calvaria in the Latin, because it's a translation from the Greek. So what is it in the Greek? Luke wrote this, and he used a word here that is interesting, but it's one that you will be very familiar with. The Greek word that Luke wrote was cranium, spelled with a K. We adopted that in the English language, and we spell it with a C. It means the same as Calvaria, skull, the place of the skull. Now, Christ was crucified on the location or place of the skull. And so, Calvary doesn't explain that. I mean, the English word Calvary doesn't really explain that to you. Now, the other three gospel translations of the location do not use the Greek word, as Luke did in Luke. Matthew, Mark, and John use the word Golgotha. Golgotha. Now, what's Golgotha? The skull. But what language is? It's not Greek, it's Aramaic. That is, it was brought back by the Jews from the captivity. It's Chaldean mixed with Hebrew, and that was the talking language of the day. Christ most likely was speaking Aramaic as the everyday language, although they retained classical Hebrew in writing, but when it came to speaking, it was what was called Aramaic. And Golgotha is an untranslated word from the Aramaic language. It means the same thing. So what do they all have in common? The skull, whether it's cranium, whether it's Calvaria, or whether it's Golgotha, it's the skull. Now, where's the skull? I didn't take time to look it up, but I remember from when we were there years ago, an English, archaeologist or whatever, around the 1850s was over there and looking out from the old city, and across the street, which is today paved but wasn't then, at the Damascus Gate, you could see this shape on the hillside across the street, and it looks like a skull. And that became the location for Protestants to say that this is where the crucifixion took place, although we can't verify that it actually was, because they knew that the Catholic location, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre presently stands, is not the location. How did some of those Catholic churches and so forth, where everything happened, how was it identified? Well, about 300 and something, 325, a little later, AD, Emperor Constantine's mother was converted to Catholicism. She came to, we'll call it Palestine or Judea, either way. And she identified them, and she said it was over there, here. So they build a church here, build a church there, they give it a name. Over here is the Holy Cup. That's where he was crucified, under that church. That didn't sit well with the Protestant people, and when they saw that, especially the hills, I think it's outside the Damascus Gate, I'm pretty sure it is, right there, actually there's a bus stop over there on that side where the buses stop, and right above it, because there's a mound or hill, and it looks like a human skull. And so that, they said, is Calvary, or Calvaria, or Cranium, or Golgotha. And Golgotha has been, you find in 3 out of the 4 gospel accounts, it's Golgotha from the Aramaic language, means the skull. The other 3, Matthew 27 and verse 33, Mark 15 verse 22, and John 19 verse 17, that you will see it is Golgotha, untranslated Aramaic word. All right, I think that covers those things that I never got to before, or covered them up and didn't realize it, and that's why I missed it. Prophecy has always been a very intriguing subject for students of the Bible. To understand history in advance, to know what to be looking for, and to know the final outcome is very exciting. But understanding prophecy has not always been easy for a lot of people. There are many interpretations about the same prophecies. One example is the prophecies about the day of the Lord. What is the day of the Lord? Now, some think it is going to church on Sunday, the Lord's Day, taken from Revelation 1 verse 10, where that phrase is given, the Lord's Day. Actually, the theme of the book of Revelation is the day of the Lord, but the Lord's Day is not a day of the week. The Lord's Day is talking about, as we will see, a year in the future to come. I'd like to look here today, in the time I have left. This is a big subject, but we're going to get through it. The day of the Lord. It is especially interesting when we see what's going on now as wars and the type of war being fought over there in Ukraine, and just shooting missiles and things at the civilian population, at the apartments, and killing many, many people. And that there is no conscience about taking innocent lives in any way whatsoever. We will see later in this sermon, if you've seen the pictures of there in the Ukraine, of the bodies laying in the streets. Well, we're going to see there's going to be a couple bodies in the streets of Jerusalem before Christ returns, and we will see this as we go along. What is meant by the expression day of the Lord? Let's begin there with that. Is it a 24-hour day, the day of the Lord? Well, the expression has to do with future events and prophecy. And in prophecy, as we will see, a day is as a year. Let me just give you these quickly, we'll turn to them. 2 scriptures that tell us a day is as a year when we're looking at prophecy. It's good to keep in mind. And you'll see as a result also this one, when we go to Isaiah, will show specifically this day is a year. But this is how we look at many things. The 70 weeks prophecy, I'll just digress a moment, we have to count. The Jewish people counted. They were familiar with that prophecy. They were looking for the Messiah when Christ came the first time because they know how to count. And they were counting a day as a year of the 70 weeks prophecy. And so they knew it had to be near. Well, look here at Numbers chapter. How did they find that out or know that? Well, their teachers told them. Numbers 14 and verse 34. But they presumed to go up to the mountaintop. Nevertheless, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong verse here. I said 34, that's what I want. And now, according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. Second year going into the Exodus, and they went up, you know the story, they came back, they rejected everything. Only Caleb and Joshua gave a favorable report. God said, you were up there 40 days, you're going to be here for 40 years. Day is as a year. The other one is Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6, Ezekiel 4:6. Good to keep these two scriptures somewhere where you, because you're not going to be looking at them every day, you'll forget about them, but somewhere where you can go back to remind yourself when you need to, when you might be studying something on prophecy. In Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6, and when you have completed them, lie again on your right side, then you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah for 40 days, and I have laid on you a day for each year. So this one is a prophecy, of course, here in Ezekiel, and showing that it would be a day as a year. That's been a standard understanding, and being able to understand how long a prophecy which is given in days actually means in years. Not just only the day of the Lord, but in other prophecies as well. Now, is the Bible specific about how long the day of the Lord is? And the answer is yes. Let's look here in Isaiah 34. Isaiah 34. Three scriptures here in Isaiah tell us exactly how long the day of the Lord is. In Isaiah 34 and in verse 8, for it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion. And Zion, of course, also is a symbolic of the church, and not just of a physical location in Jerusalem. Now Isaiah 61, we see it again here. Isaiah 61, and in verse 2. To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Yes, it is a day of vengeance. It's a year of vengeance when it's God's wrath that is going to be poured out. And he does take note of what's happening in the Ukraine, and many, many things before and since, and yet to happen in the future. And it will come to that point where, yes, he will punish mankind for all the murdering and evil that man is doing to his fellow man. Now also here in Isaiah, let's take a look at turn the page, chapter 63. And here's the third place, and then verse 4. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come. And the year of my redeemed, we're the redeemed, aren't we? Isn't that the purpose of the sacrifice of Christ? And so, yes, he is going to what? Cut the days short, too. And remember there in Matthew 24. And for the elect's sake. And so they will not perish. All right, so we see a couple things. The day is as a year, and specifically that the day of the Lord is a full year of time. Now, where is this mentioned in the Bible? So many places you might want to ask, where is it not mentioned in the Bible? It is a very, very heavily spoken of in the Old Testament, and then, as we will see a little more in time, in the book of Revelation. Let's go to Isaiah 13. I'm not going to read all these chapters, but some of the verses, just so you will recognize when we do go to Revelation some of the language. And a lot of things that Jesus gave to John on the Isle of Patmos was not new or original at that time, but it was from the prophets of the Old Testament. And the difference is that he put it and gave a sequence of events in the book of Revelation where you do not have that in the books in the Old Testament. Here in Isaiah, what did I say? Chapter 13. And we won't read the whole chapter. But let's go to verse 6. Wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand, or the year of the Lord is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be limp. Every man's heart will melt. You know, you're going to see language like that in the book of Revelation. Verse 8, and they will be afraid. Pangs and sorrows will take hold of them, and they will be in pain as a woman in childbirth, and they will be amazed at one another. Their faces will be like flames. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. And for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Now, I think you've seen that before, the Olivet prophecy, Matthew 24, as well as the book of Revelation. When did Isaiah write Isaiah? Somewhere between 700 and 800 BC. Now, if this is all you had, when is that going to happen? A lot of time has gone by since Isaiah wrote this, right? Verse 11, I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity, and I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. And he goes on, two more verses. I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold, a man more than the golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore, verse 13, I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts and in the day of his fierce anger. Wobble in its orbit? Now, that would be frightening, wouldn't it? That would be incredibly frightening. How will he do that? I don't know how that was. It by earthquakes? Is whatever? There's going to be some incredible thing. This is not the only scripture that says that. I mean, Isaiah 13:13 is not the only scripture. This is repeated in other books and so forth, as we'll look and see. So as early as 800 BC, the day of the Lord is being spoken of here through Isaiah. And he speaks of it more than once. If you turn the pages to Isaiah 24, is another chapter on the day of the Lord, the year of the Lord. That people would fear and repent and turn to God. Of course, they won't. But why is this being given? To scare everybody to death? Well, hopefully to get people's attention, because it will happen one day. Isaiah 24, let's go to verse 18. It shall be that he who flees from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit, and he who comes up from the midst of the pit shall be caught in the snare. For the windows from on high are open, and the foundations of the earth are shaken. Now we will see later in the book of Revelation that apparently more than just a meteor might strike the earth. Something big enough that might move it from its orbit. Something so big that 1/3 of everything in the ocean will be destroyed. Apparently it will hit in one of the oceans. And you see, it's talking about some of this, the earth being shaken, the earth being moved. Verse 19, the earth is violently broken. The earth is split open. The earth is shaken exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall totter like a hut. Its transgression shall be heavy upon it, and it will fall and not rise again, as he goes on here to say. Down verse 23, then the moon will be disgraced and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. Now, other scriptures we'll see describe it as becoming quite dark. But here, it's interesting, some of the information given to us about what is going to come. And this, of course, we know is prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ, 800 BC. And we have 2 chapters already. Well, does it just end there? No, it does not. Let's go to the minor prophets, to the book of Joel, right after Amos. Not after Amos. Yes, it is, between Amos and Hosea, I'm sorry. Right after Hosea. In the book of Joel, here is a theme. The whole 3-chapter scroll of Joel is the day of the Lord. In chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, blow the trumpet in Zion. Interesting, blow the trumpet. That's exactly what's going to be done in the book of Revelation. 7 of them are going to be blowing. And sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand. When did Joel write this? About the same time as Isaiah. Give or take, either before or a little after. That's a long time ago, and yet he said the day of the Lord is coming. It is at hand. Is this written for the generation when it will take place? Because, 2,700 years have gone by since he wrote that. And yet he is talking very plainly, and he sees it. It's given to him in a vision. Then if we go across to verse 31 and 32 at the end of the chapter, the sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. How awesome is awesome? We use this word casually a lot of times, but in this case, I don't think we can really comprehend how awesome is going to be. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And some will, as we'll see. In fact, the first question I had earlier here on the 144,000, why does it mention that? Because they are being sealed from the day of the Lord. And they are calling on the name of the Lord in tribulation. And so God has them sealed, and so they will not have to go through and experience and die from all the things that are going to happen in that last 1 year, the year of God's wrath that he will bring. While we're here in Joel chapter 3 and verse 1 and 2, for behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, Kidron Valley. And I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, which they took captive, which they carried out Holocaust on them, far more than World War II time, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have also divided up my land, and so on. God is not going to forget those that he punishes. And he is going to bring them back. He will bring his own revenge on those who have done terrible things to them. And he will protect those who are in captivity at that time from the day of the Lord and bring them back. Well, let's get into another subject there, but after Christ returns, they will be brought back to the Middle East. Another book in the minor prophets is Zephaniah. If you go forward here just a few books, a small one, and it right after Nahum, Habakkuk, then Zephaniah. The theme of this, Zephaniah is a prophet. We don't really know much about him, do we? Or even Joel. I mean, they weren't politicians or individuals involved in the governments that we know of during the period of the kings. Isaiah was. We know more about him. Micah was one who was contemporary with Isaiah. But here we have a fellow, Zephaniah, that tells you when he lived and everything. Again, very anciently. Some of these are interesting because they're basically within the same time period of 800 BC. And then after that, we don't see a whole lot of new prophecies about the day of the Lord as prophets who were called later, before the captivity, before the Babylonian captivity, and so on. Do you see anything in the book of Daniel where he's talking about the day of the Lord? How about Ezekiel? They were both in the captivity. Jeremiah, certain things that they do talk about that will happen during that time, but they don't specifically talk about the day or the year of the Lord, whereas these prophets did. A couple here, and then we'll move on. Zephaniah, chapter 1, verse 2 and 3. I will utterly consume everything from the face of the land, says the Lord. I will consume man and beast. I will consume the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, and the stumbling. How's he going to consume the fish of the sea? Book of Revelation tells us something's going to hit the sea, apparently from outer space. Some sort of meteor, maybe an asteroid, I don't know. And the stumbling blocks along with the wicked, and I will cut off man from the face of the land, says the Lord. That time is coming here. Then a couple other verses, down to verse 14. The great day of the Lord is near. Generations have come and gone. Interesting. Is it near to us? Well, it's obviously much more near, isn't it? When we look and see what man has for weapons and what he can use, and the book of Revelation indicates, I think, very clearly that such weapons are going to be used and are described in the 9th chapter of Revelation. So we're living in that time very close. Yes, the great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. There the mighty men shall cry out. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastation and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess. We'll see that here in other scriptures too. And verse 16, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers, a time of war. The trumpet, the shofar used there to blow the horn, shut the gates. There will be a time of great war taking place. One last one, Zechariah 14. Zechariah chapter 14, just to show you a little bit about what was written. Zechariah was one of the last of the prophets before the intertestament period, 520, in that period of BC. He was, let's say, 500 years before the coming of Christ, and he was at the time of the finishing of the construction of the Second Temple, which lasted, 600 years up until 70 AD. And but they're all talking in the present tense. We're right now, it's going to happen. Maybe it was written that way. I'm not sure I have a full explanation as to why. Obviously, it will happen. Everything points to that when you read the books, and of course, and you look at the New Testament, the Olivet Prophecy, and the book of Revelation. A couple of scriptures, and we're going to move to the New Testament here. In Zechariah, what did I say, chapter 14, verse 1, behold, the day of the Lord is coming. You notice how many times we read that expression, the day of the Lord? How many times in Isaiah, Joel, Zephaniah, now Zechariah? There's a lot to be, it must be very important to have so much written about it and said about it. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming. Your spoil will be divided in your midst, and I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity. The remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Apparently some will remain. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. This is what everything at the day of the Lord leads to. This is the end of the day of the Lord. And we're going to see in the book of Revelation, it is not going to be the end of all the terrible things that are going to happen. They will continue after Christ returns. And I'll point that out here. Which faces, Jerusalem on the east and so on. And then verse 9, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. And in that day it shall be that the Lord is one and his name is one. All right, let's go to the New Testament. The Olivet prophecy, Matthew 24, very quickly, just only a couple verses there. Reminder verses to most of you, I think. Matthew 24. Now, we have the Olivet prophecy is covered in Luke 13, and Mark 13, and in Luke 17 and 21. 17 and 21. It's divided there in Luke's account. John does not have an Olivet prophecy in his gospel. Here in Matthew 24 and verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, now the tribulation is separated from the day of the Lord. It's not one and the same. They are separate. Excuse me. You have the tribulation, heavenly signs, day of the Lord, coming of Christ. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. What is the sign of the Son of Man? I don't know what the sign of the Son of something that I guess will be. I don't think it's going to be a sign that the world will understand, but the church will. Verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now that's not talking about the third heaven. That's talking about the heaven, the Oranos, the atmosphere, and that he's going to gather them up. I am the resurrection, John 11:25. And they are not going to be, the saints are not in heaven. They are in the grave. Their spirit returns to God who gave it. And when the angel comes, he will gather them from all the areas where they died on the earth. And they will become a new being, spirit. As Paul spoke of in 1 Corinthians there, is it 15 verse 44, I think? A spiritual body that we will all have and live forever. That's what glory is. It talks about the glory. It's the glory of being a spirit being. Death can never come. And there's great energy, there's great power that is given that a son of God will have. And that's what our destiny is, to be many sons brought to glory through Jesus Christ. Now let's go to the book of Revelation. As I said earlier, that the book of Revelation really gives us more of a sequence of events. What we've looked at in the Old Testament, many terrible and horrible things, but exactly when do these things happen? What's their order? We wouldn't know. How could you put it together to answer that question if all you had was the Old Testament? This is interesting that at the end of the first century, when John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, the Father through Christ and to his angel to John, gave this book we call Revelation. And amazing the things here. Now, there are a lot of things, much of it is symbolism. Some of it we do not know exactly what it is, but we can pretty well see or guess pretty closely what some of the symbolisms are talking about. Now, chapter 8, chapter 6 and verse 17, the last verse. Now we have the 7 seals. You know, the number 7, number of perfection, completion in the Bible. So in chapter 6, you have the 7 seals, right? And when you get to verse 17, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand and against that kind of wrath that's going to come? Then we have an inset chapter on the 144,000, which is chapter 7. Then we pick up the 7th seal, the day of the Lord, again, chapter 8. And here in verse 1, and when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. So the 7th seal has 7 trumpets. The other 6 seals do not have any trumpets, but this one does. 7 seals, the 7th seal has 7 trumpets, the 7th trumpet has 7 plagues. 7, 7, and 7. Interesting, those numbers. I don't want to read it all. I'll just go through a couple of them here. You can read some of the descriptions. Verse 3 and another, let's go down to verse 7. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood. They were thrown to the earth, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. We had a nice little thunderstorm last night, and my lawn just ate it up. It's been dry, even though I do water it, and I love to see it turn green. In the years we have lived here, this is the dry season. It's right about that time now where the seasonal thunderstorms will start in, and things will begin to come back and green up. Why, even all of the weeds are going to turn green. And always like to see that, thankful for it. How these things, this is going to be an incredible thing where all of this will dry up and be dead and not have vegetation. Now, there is the ability when Christ returns for that to all come back, because, you know, the seeds will be in the ground. They just need water. I like the shows in Africa. You know, they have a dry season, everything is bone dry and dead. But when the rains come, in time-lapse photography, I've seen these wild flowers and things begin to come up, and what's the name of that place where all the animals go to? Is it the Kalahari or something like that? And water comes back. And the animals know where to go to get the water that previously had dried up. They return and they follow it. And all this barren ground suddenly is becoming green. It's blossoming like the rose, as the Bible would say. All these beautiful flowers, wildflowers are coming up and everything. So the mechanism for rejuvenation is what I'm trying to get to, will be there. And when Christ returns. If not, he'll create it again, but I believe it's all there because we've seen it happen many times over the years here on the earth. Now, let's go here a little bit further. How about I just read about the first trumpet. Vegetation is struck. The second trumpet, the seas are struck. Something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. By the way, did you see what happened in Mississippi? People were reporting apparently it was a huge meteor that came down, a burning ball of fire. So I was reading about it in the paper this morning, having my coffee, and that it was seen by quite a large number of people. And they know that it was more than just your regular little meteor coming in. Apparently it was a pretty good sized one. And saw this big burning bowl of fire. Look at this one. This is going to be, that one that just reported to the news people is nothing compared to the one that's going to hit here at this time. This is part of God's wrath, the day, the year of the Lord. And a third of the living creatures in the sea died. So it's going to hit the ocean somewhere. That's going to be an incredible thing. Some of you might be familiar with in 1908, some kind of giant meteor hit in Siberia, out where there was literally nothing. It did not impact the ground, as they now know, because of its velocity and its the heat as a result entering the atmosphere. It exploded like a nuclear bomb and wiped out, just turned the Siberian forest into matchsticks and crumpled them over. An incredible explosion. Some of the most destructive part is not actually hitting and making a crater, but exploding from the incredible heat that is generated coming in at that speed into this atmosphere, through the atmosphere of this earth. This thing, does it impact or does it explode over the ocean to kill all of these creatures? I don't know. We'll just. But the things we see today that man has learned, and sometimes on these various documentary shows or whatever, if you see one, they go back and explain some of the stuff that has already happened in part. It's really quite interesting thinking, especially if you know what's going to come in the future, how that's going to be carried out. Well, going on then, we have the third one, the waters struck, verse 10. It fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. Now what that is and how it hit a third of the rivers and springs of water, I don't know. But again, notice the difference of information that you have here on the day of the Lord compared to what we read in Isaiah or Joel. Tremendous amount more information. Going down, the fifth trumpet, we'll go down, I'm skipping over some. Chapter 9, we have what's going to become 3 woes. The last 3 trumpets are so bad, so incredible, they are called woes when they strike and hit. The word woe, by the way, in verse 13 of chapter 8, is from the Greek word, I'll just spell it, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, O-U-A-I, O-U-A-I, and it means expression of grief, and is rendered alas in Revelation 18, verse 10, 16, and 19. But an expression of grief that is going to fall. Now, let's read a little bit about them. Chapter 9, verse 1, the fifth angel sounded. I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit. Where who? Satan? And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Now, is this a volcano that we're looking at? Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power. As the scorpions of the earth have power, they were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or the green things, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Are we talking here about locusts? I think all of us have seen grasshoppers, right? Locusts. And is it symbolic of something else? In verse 5, and they were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. Locusts do not have, you ever seen a locust that can strike like a scorpion? You know, scorpions got in their tail, and you don't want to get on the wrong side of them. And some of them can be very, very, well, I guess there's a couple of that can be deadly. Most of them just make you pretty sick. Then verse 6, in those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. The shape of the locusts were like horses prepared for... You ever seen a locust that looked like a horse? On their heads were crowns of something like gold. The faces were like the faces of men. We got human beings here involved in whatever this is. And had hair like a woman's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates, like breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. We have many times speculated, did John see into the future, or given to him by the angel to see into the future? Modern weapons. He had no idea of how to compare them. He had no idea how to explain them. Was he seeing jet aircraft? Can you, in the first century, how would you've never heard of any such thing? And the sound and the weapons fired, firing a missile from under its wings to take out something either in the air or on the ground. We've speculated, and it's the only thing that seems sensible to us. Now, how would you have understood this if you had read this 100 years ago, if you were alive? It probably wouldn't mean anything. You wouldn't be able to figure it out, would you? What if after the Civil War, you sit down to read about the day of the Lord, and you're reading this? What would it mean to you? You know, locusts that can sting like a scorpion, and they have hair like men, and they seem to be controlled by man. Still, we have difficulty today, don't we? But I think because we're a little closer to that time, we can begin to see some things that might identify with what he is seeing and trying to describe here. All right, going on, I'll just skip down verse 12. One woe is past, behold, 2 more woes are coming. So the 6th trumpet and then the 7th trumpet. You know, this is very interesting because you begin to read the things that are going to take place here in chapter 9 and then compare it to chapter 16, 15 and 16. I don't want to go over time. I'm going to leave some of this for you to read and look at and contemplate over as well. Now we get into some real interesting battles. Well, I shouldn't use that word. It's not interesting. It's sad. It's terrible. Verse 17. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire and smoke and brimstone. And by these 3 plagues, a third of mankind was killed, and by fire and the smoke of the brimstone which came out of their mouths. Do you know of any other weapon that man has that can kill a third of mankind? It's like... This is for us to understand. And when Isaiah was writing and saying the day of the Lord is near, the day of the Lord is at hand, was that written for the end time generation? It certainly wasn't for his. That was 2,700 years ago. So it makes you think that what he was writing was written for the time of the end, not for his generation at all. Then when you look at this, there's only one thing that I know of that man could kill a third of: nuclear weapons. And they're described here with fire, smoke, and brimstone. And by these three, fire, smoke, and brimstone. I mean, incredible what could take place. And God is going to allow man to do that. And Jesus said, except those days be shortened, no flesh should be saved alive. He will intervene. If he waits a day later, there will not be anything to intervene for. God is going to allow man to come to that point where he's had a certain freedom to do and be destructive as much as he wants to choose to be, and he will stop him at the last day. Now we're going to do it my way for 1,000 years. And I'm going to destroy all of this and start all over. You know, it's interesting, you read about the Noachian flood. I'm sorry that I ever made man, chapter 6, Genesis. I'm going to wipe man out, and I'm going to start all over with you, Noah. Well, he would never do that again by water. That's why we have the rainbow, the covenant. But when you look at the state of man and where human beings are going, it's almost like, as it said, in the days of Noah. So shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. What did he have to do? I need to start over. I have to start over. I won't annihilate him totally, but I will start over. And that's what you see here is being described. Okay, a couple more things. I'm going to skip over some of this. Of the war in chapter 9. It's quite interesting reading about that. I use the word interesting. How can that be interesting in one sentence? That's the wrong choice of words. But let's go quickly here to chapter 11, and I'm coming to an end as we look at chapter 11. And verse 11. Now after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, the two witnesses, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw it. I guess so. Wouldn't that be something? You go to a funeral and you have the casket open and everybody's sitting there and viewing old George, and suddenly he sets up. Well, that would get some attention, wouldn't it? By the way, things similar to that in North Carolina. When was it? A couple of years ago, there was a car accident, and the ambulance people, EMS, whatever they were, they pronounced the person dead at the scene and took him to the morgue. Well, one of the assistants in the morgue was coming in to check and get ready to prepare the body for a funeral. The body started moving. And you imagine that. And they immediately, of course, got the ambulance, get him to the hospital. I don't know if the person ever survived that or not, and but certainly was not dead. The ambulance crew lost their jobs over that for that diagnosis that he was dead, bringing him there. And anyhow, talk about being startled. That would. And of course, when these people rise, let me move on here to what I want to get to. Verse 14 and 15. Second woe is past. That's when they were killed and resurrected. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. Then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying that the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So the seventh angel sounds the trumpet, and Christ returns to reign. And the word become there should be as becoming. And but something interesting, if you just turn back to chapter 14 or head to 14, we're down to the seventh trumpet, right? Christ, I read that because Christ returns on the seventh trumpet. So it's all over, right? No, it isn't. Chapter 14, and get my verses here, verse 9 and 10. Then a third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast in his image and receives his mark on his forehead or in his on his hands, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb." So Christ has returned. What's left? The 7 plagues of the 7th trumpet, which are carried out after Christ returns. A lot of times people have thought that all has taken place before he returns. But no, it says it's going to be carried out here. These things will be carried out. Then you go in 15 and 16 is where you have, especially 16, the 7 last plagues, also called 7 bowls. I like the word plagues better. I think it is a better description of it. In Revelation 15:1, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having 7 last plagues, for in them the wrath of God is complete." So the day of the Lord is not quite finished, is it? The wrath of God is now going to be complete as these are poured out. But Christ and the angels have returned to the earth. They've returned to the earth. That means because when he returns, the saints rise to meet him in the air and come down with him. Knowing this, are we going to have a part in this? We will not be human beings anymore. We will be sons of God and members of the family of God. All right, I'm going to quit there and on the subject of the day of the Lord. Obviously, when something is big, written about as much as this subject is from the Old Testament through particularly to the book of Revelation, it is something important that God wants us to see it, to understand it, to act in our present life accordingly, to change where we have to change, because his wrath is coming. Well, I hope this helps us to better understand the day or the year of the Lord from the New Testament and now particularly the book of Revelation.